Hi, and welcome to session 8. This is vocabulary instruction. Why are some words so important? The content objectives of today's session are for you to be able to articulate the importance of learning vocabulary for all students, for English language learners, and for secondary students in disciplinary contexts. You should also be able to distinguish between 4 different types of vocabulary encountered by students in the classroom and be able to discuss 4 different approaches to learning vocabulary. So why is vocabulary such a big deal? Well, the California Common Core Anchor standards in language really focus on vocabulary. Here's what they say. They say that students at the secondary level should be able to determine or clarify the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words through context clues, analysis of word parts, and reference materials. And you'll see if you look at the SBAC test, how nuanced the differences are between various definitions that they're asking for students to be able to articulate at a higher level. And so it's really important that we explicitly teach vocabulary in our classes. The standards also say that students should be able to demonstrate an understanding of figurative language, word relationships, and nuanced meanings. And again, as I said, especially in the 11th grade level, the nuanced aspects can be very, very difficult in terms of both disciplinary vocabulary and just standard academic vocabulary in general. And finally, it says in the Common Core that students should be able to acquire and use accurately a range of general academic and domain-specific words, so that's discipline-specific words, and phrases sufficient for reading, writing, speaking, and listening at the college and career readiness level. So we're talking pretty high expectations and varied uses of vocabulary that students are expected to master at the secondary level, as articulated by the standards. One last thing, the standards say that students should be able to demonstrate independence in gathering vocabulary knowledge when encountering an unknown term important to comprehension or expression. And that's why the importance of teaching vocabulary strategies is so paramount, right? We have to be able to teach students how to independently access the vocabulary. We can't always give them the definitions. So we have to kind of help them to figure out authentic strategies that work for them. So why is vocabulary such a big deal for English language learners? If you've done the PSYOP reading for this week, you may have seen some of these statements. One thing that's really important for English was the sophisticated vocabulary that's included in content area text, disciplinary text, and in disciplinary lectures. So it's really important that students have access to that vocabulary because it helps them to make meaning of the larger context and text. Standardized tests also require knowledge of specialized and wide-ranging academic and content-specific vocabulary. So again, when we think about the SBAC, that's one example, but also the PSAT, the SAT, all of those big gatekeeper tests will require a specialized understanding of a wide range of vocabulary. Since English language learners are second learners, or language learners in general are second learners of this secondary vocabulary, their instruction must be accelerated to catch up with their native speaking peers. And that's really important. So how do we accelerate that instruction? We have to focus on specific vocabulary instruction. And that's especially challenging for English language learners because the acquisition of deep understandings of word meanings is very challenging. So students who are second language learners often have a hard time in understanding nuanced differences in degree, in genre, in closely related words. And so that's why it's really important that they're exposed to a lot of vocabulary and that they're shown the differences between similar meaning words. So why is discipline-specific vocabulary also so important? Well, first, the language of our disciplines helps us to communicate key concepts and ideas within our field. So by using specific language, we're actually able to articulate key ideas and concepts that we can't articulate any other way, right? So the idea of democracy or humanism or any of the isms are really important in social studies, right? Or when we talk about the transitive property of addition or of multiplication, or the identity property, for example, it's really important that students know that language because it's really essential to defining the concept in mathematics or in history. And so it's important for us to think about how the language of our disciplines actually shapes the key concepts that we want students to understand in our fields. Another example from English, for example, is figurative language, which may not be in other content areas. Or scientific inquiry as a process and an iterative process of learning. So all of these things are really important in helping students to understand discipline-specific vocabulary. I'm sorry I didn't animate this slide. But specific vocabulary also demonstrates belonging into particular discourse communities and signals competencies or can be a gatekeeper in preventing understanding. So, what I mean by that is each of our disciplines has a particular language. And if you know that language, so if you know what a quadratic equation is, or you know that you should be solving for the roots of an expression, that demonstrates that you understand what's going on in a particular context, right? If you know what cognates are or a transitive and intransitive verb, that may demonstrate belonging to a different discourse community. So if you think about each of our disciplines as communities in which we need a specialized language to fully participate, then vocabulary can either be a marker of belonging or a marker of exclusion. And that's really important to you as a future disciplinary teacher because you're really the only ones who can teach vocabulary in your specific context. So I know a wide range of disciplinary vocabularies because I happen to have 3 credentials and have taught in 3 different content areas, as well as supporting in other content areas. However, most of us are specialists, right? And we know how the vocabulary is used in our field. And it would be difficult for an English teacher, for example, to teach the way that variable is used differently in science than it is in mathematics. And so it's really important that we help students to understand how words are used in our own context. The final thing is that discipline-specific vocabulary allows us to address concepts with more clarity and specificity and often signals that nuanced conceptual understanding that can be so hard for our English language learners. So when we are focusing on vocabulary or specific vocabulary phrases, it helps us to really get down to what we mean and nuance what we mean in different ways than if we're talking just generally. So if we talk a number from one side of an equation to another, it's very different than when we're talking about isolating a variable or combining like terms, because we're not really getting at the mathematical concepts behind what you're actually doing when you're moving one thing over to the other side. Okay, when we say we're moving all the numbers over to the other side by doing the opposite, using that kind of non-specific language may help students to get what they're supposed to do, but not the mathematical reasoning behind it. Okay, and it's the same thing with other types of processes and other types of conceptual understanding that we really want students to learn in various disciplines. So what are the types of vocabulary that students encounter? And I'm sorry for my poor lack of animation again in this lecture, but there are 4 different types of vocabulary that students are likely to encounter. General vocabulary, which are everyday words with widely acknowledged meanings in common use. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on general vocabulary in our secondary classes unless we have a large number of language learners, right? So if you are a world language teacher or if you have beginning or emerging level English language learners, then you may need to spend some time on some more general vocabulary words, particularly if they're in idiomatic phrases. But generally, it's the other 3 categories, starting with special vocabulary. Special vocabulary are words from everyday life or general vocabulary that take on specialized meaning when adapted to a particular content area. For example, the word play. So a play in English literature, right, reading a play of Shakespeare, is going to be different than the verb play. In PE is different than running a play in football if you're in a particular unit. And even playing, right, a game is different than playing a video. And so it's really important for us to, even with these general words that take on particular meanings in our content for us to be aware of them and help students to understand the nuanced differences even in these everyday words when they're used in a specific way in our content area. The next type of vocabulary is disciplinary vocabulary, which is also called technical vocabulary in the SIOP book. And these are words that have usage and application only in a particular subject matter field. So those are those discipline specific vocabulary words that I was talking about in the last slide. And then finally, and this can be often the most difficult, is structural academic vocabulary. So similar to special vocabulary, these are words that can be used in different ways across different disciplines, but they are academic language words instead of everyday words. So for example, the word justify. So if you were to justify a triangle to the right, that's very different than saying that you want a student to justify their response. And even when we talk about justifying our response, which generally means something similar across content areas, the types of evidence that we're able to draw from in order to justify our responses may be different. And so it's really important to be specific with students when we're using these different types of vocabulary that are important to our fields. So there are various types of vocabulary strategies in class, or a few of these types, but the first type that I wanted to preview was looking inside words, or working with roots and affixes. So word parts can help students to learn new vocabulary based upon English morphology. And that's also very helpful for students who may have a first language that's other than English, especially if it's a Latin-based language because English has a lot of Latin-based roots. This type of strategy, looking inside words with using roots and affixes, can be particularly important when used in combination with context or when context is absent, as in standardized tests. So in other words, it can add to the strategy of using context clues, but it can also help students to tackle a word when there's nothing else around the word that could give them any clues. And it's interesting because if we look at prefixes and roots, we can look at word meaning. And if we look at suffixes, we look at word parts, right? We look at parts of speech. And so there's a list of common roots, and also in the word consciousness, it talks about kind of word endings in the Echeverria, the SIOP text on page 77. So a second type of strategy is looking around the words and helping students to access vocabulary in text or in context. And one of the things that you can help students become more aware of are typographic clues. So within text, often footnotes, italics, or bold-faced print that tells you this is the key word that you're looking for. Parenthetical or comma splice definition, so where you'll have a word and you'll have a comma and then the definition and another comma. If any of you read Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, the way that he actually gets the lexile level to be higher is he'll embed these complex multisyllabic words, and then he'll use comma splice definitions to define those words in the context. And other types of clues that can be found in text are pictures that can give definitions, or give visuals that help students get meaning, and then graphs, charts, or tables that are organized to help students find. Another type of clue that students can use are syntactic or semantic clues, and those include definitions that can be found in a vocabulary box at the beginning or the end or on the side of text, linked synonyms. So sometimes you'll see a word and instead of the comma splice definition, it'll be a linked word that is similar. Direct description or restatement of a particular vocabulary word, contrast, so unlike this, this word is like this, cause and effect, and then mood and tone can help students to get at those more nuanced meanings, particularly in specialized vocabulary. We're going to be focusing in class mostly on vocabulary strategies that are active, interactive, and multimodal. So for example, this word card that you see is a multimodal activity You can see there's a visual there in the illustration. There's a context clue of the word in context. There's the definition, and then there's the word itself. And this is similar to what you might see in the Freyer model. The boxes are a little bit different. It's example, non-example definition. But the ideas are very similar, and it's how do we get students to have a deeper meaning and understanding by exposing them in multiple ways to vocabulary. And then finally, the last type of vocabulary strategy is using resources or references to find meaning, and that's looking outside of text. So helping students to find digital tools or dictionaries that can help them to understand word meanings. So there are traditional dictionaries, glossary, and thesauri. The problem with that is that students often pick the first definition, which is the most common definition, and that's not always the definition of the word in the context. And so it's really important that if you teach using these traditional or even the content specific dictionaries, like I'm showing below, that you teach students to really think about how the word is still used in the context or in the context of the concept that you're looking at. And these are a few subject-specific dictionaries. The links are live in the PowerPoint that I'll attach on Beachboard. And then, of course, there's dictionary.com, and Merriam-Webster also has its own dictionary online that a lot of people use as well. So the content objectives for today's lecture were for you to be able to articulate the importance of learning vocabulary for all students, for language learners in particular, and for secondary students in disciplinary context, to distinguish between those four types of vocabulary encountered by students in the classroom, and to be able to discuss four different approaches to learning vocabulary, which we'll work on more in class. I look forward to seeing you then, and thanks so much for your